On a narrow mountain pass northeast of Los Angeles, two of California's most important fault systems come close enough to influence one another. Above them, Interstate 15 carries traffic through the mountains every day. Rail lines, pipelines, electrical infrastructure, water systems, and communications networks all pass through this corridor. But underground, something much older is happening. For roughly 1,000 years, earthquakes have repeatedly changed the amount of stress stored in these faults. Now, scientists have built a new model that reconstructs that history through space and time, and what it shows about the present-day stress around Cajon Pass is getting serious attention. The model doesn't predict an earthquake tomorrow. It doesn't give California a countdown. Instead, it reveals something more subtle. The San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems are currently carrying unusually high levels of stress, and their relative balance may help determine whether a future earthquake stops at the junction or continues across it. The location is Cajon Pass, roughly 50 miles northeast of downtown Los Angeles. At first glance, it looks like a normal mountain corridor. The highway cuts between the hills, trains move through the pass, and the surrounding landscape is a mixture of dry mountains, vegetation, and scattered development. But this particular gap in the mountains exists in one of the most complicated parts of Southern California's fault system. The San Andreas Fault and the San Jacinto Fault approach one another in this region. They are not two perfectly straight lines running independently through the landscape. They bend, branch, and interact through a complicated network of smaller structures. And where major faults come close together, something important can happen. An earthquake that begins on one fault can stop, or, under the right conditions, it can continue onto another. Scientists studying this behavior have described the Cajon Pass area as an earthquake gate. It isn't a physical gate underground. There is no hidden door opening beneath the mountains. The term describes a junction where the mechanical conditions may influence whether an earthquake rupture remains on one fault or manages to cross onto another. And that matters because the length of a rupture has a huge influence on the size of an earthquake. A rupture that stops after breaking one segment is one event. A rupture that continues across a major fault junction can involve much more of the Earth's crust. California's own geological history shows that both kinds of behavior have happened. On December 8, 1812, a major earthquake struck Southern California. Geological evidence suggests that the rupture may have crossed the Cajon Pass area and involved both the San Andreas and San Jacinto systems. The exact extent of that ancient rupture remains uncertain, but the possibility of a through-going event is supported by geological evidence. Then came January 9, 1857. The Fort Tejon earthquake was approximately magnitude 7.9 and produced a massive surface rupture along the southern San Andreas Fault. The ground shifted dramatically across a huge portion of Southern California. Trees were displaced, streams were offset, and the landscape itself was permanently changed. But the rupture stopped at Cajon Pass. The earthquake had produced one of the largest known ruptures in California's historical record, yet it did not continue onto the San Jacinto system. So now researchers have a fascinating geological puzzle. Why did one earthquake appear capable of crossing the junction, while another enormous earthquake stopped there? What was different underground? To investigate that question, researchers created something far more sophisticated than a simple fault map. They built a four-dimensional earthquake cycle model. 3 dimensions represent physical space, the fourth represents time. Instead of looking only at where the faults are today, the researchers attempted to reconstruct how stress accumulated and changed across approximately 1,000 years of earthquake history. That required combining evidence from paleoseismology, fault geometry, slip rates, historical earthquakes, and geological measurements. Paleoseismology is particularly important here because written records only take us back so far. Long before modern seismometers existed, earthquakes were still leaving fingerprints in the ground. Scientists can dig trenches across faults and examine layers of sediment that have been disturbed by ancient earthquakes. A once flat layer might suddenly be offset. Soil might be folded. Younger material might sit beside older material in a way that reveals when the ground moved. Sometimes organic material within those layers can be dated. By comparing evidence from multiple locations, researchers can build an approximate history of when major earthquakes occurred and how different fault sections behaved. That history can then be fed into a model, and the model asks a much more interesting question than simply, how many years has it been since the last earthquake? It asks, what was the stress state of the fault system when those earthquakes happened? Because faults don't simply become dangerous because a certain number of years has passed. The physics are more complicated. The Earth's tectonic plates are constantly moving. Faults can remain locked while that movement continues, allowing strain to build. Then, when an earthquake occurs, some of that accumulated strain is suddenly released. But the released stress doesn't simply disappear. It gets redistributed. Some nearby areas can become less stressed. Others can become more stressed. And depending on the orientation and position of a neighboring fault, the same earthquake can make one section less likely to rupture while making another section more favorable for failure. This is where Coulomb stress becomes important. The name sounds technical, but the basic idea is fairly simple. Imagine several heavy objects pressing against each other. If one object suddenly moves, the forces acting on the others change. Some may be pushed away from failure, others may be pushed closer. A large earthquake can do something similar to the Earth's crust. The researchers can calculate those changes. Then they can ask whether the new stress state resembles conditions associated with past earthquakes. That is exactly what this new study attempts to do. The researchers reconstructed the stress history around 3 important segments near the Cajon Pass region and compared the modeled conditions across roughly 1,000 years. The result shows that present-day stress is high on several of the segments. The Mojave South section of the San Andreas is modeled at roughly 2.8 megapascals. The North San Bernardino segment is around 1.8 megapascals. And the San Jacinto Bernardino segment reaches approximately 3.6 megapascals. That 3.6 megapascal value is particularly interesting because it is the highest modeled stress level for that segment across the reconstructed 1,000-year history. But the most important part isn't simply that one number is high. It's the relationship between the neighboring faults. The researchers found that the stress levels on parts of the San Andreas and San Jacinto systems are becoming relatively similar. And that matters, because the earthquake gate at Cajon Pass may depend partly on how balanced the stresses are on either side of the junction. Think of it like 2 connected sections of a mechanical system. If one side is heavily loaded and the other has recently released a lot of energy, a rupture may have a harder time continuing across the junction. But if both sides are already highly stressed, the conditions may be more favorable for a rupture to move from one fault system onto another. That doesn't mean a joint earthquake is about to happen. It means the present configuration deserves attention because it resembles some of the conditions associated with past large ruptures. The model explores scenarios involving earthquakes in roughly the magnitude 7.4 to 7.8 range if multiple segments were to rupture together. But that is a scenario. It is not a forecast. The model does not say an earthquake will happen next week. It does not say one will happen this year. And it does not provide a date when the so-called earthquake gate will open. That distinction is extremely important. Earthquake science can tell us a great deal about the forces acting on a fault. It cannot currently tell us the exact moment when that fault will fail. And in fact, the model itself demonstrates why that problem is so difficult. There have been long periods in California's history when stress increased without producing a major earthquake. A fault can remain locked while strain accumulates for decades, or even centuries. From the surface, nothing dramatic may happen. The mountains remain still, roads continue carrying traffic, cities continue operating. But underground, the plates continue moving. The stress continues accumulating. Eventually, the conditions can change. But exactly when that final transition happens remains unpredictable. There is another source of uncertainty in a 1,000-year reconstruction. Ancient earthquakes don't come with labels telling scientists exactly how large they were or precisely how far their ruptures traveled. Researchers have to infer those details from geological evidence. If a trench shows that a fault moved at a particular location, scientists know an earthquake happened there. But that single site cannot always tell them whether the same earthquake continued for another 50 miles or another 200. That means researchers must combine evidence from multiple locations. Different interpretations can produce different estimates of ancient rupture lengths. The same problem applies to stress. A model requires assumptions about how faults behave, how stress is released during an earthquake, and how the surrounding crust responds afterward. Real faults are not perfectly smooth lines. They contain bends, branches, irregular surfaces, and different types of rock. Some sections creep slowly, some remain locked, some rupture completely, others rupture only partially, and neighboring faults can influence each other in ways that are difficult to reproduce perfectly inside a computer model. But that doesn't make the model useless. Quite the opposite. It gives scientists a way to test a physical explanation against geological history. If the model suggests that certain stress conditions existed before an ancient earthquake, researchers can compare that result with the geological record. If the model doesn't fit, it can be changed. If it fits repeatedly, confidence in the underlying mechanism grows. This is how earthquake science moves forward, not by predicting the next earthquake with certainty, but by improving our understanding of why earthquakes behave differently under different conditions. And Cajon Pass is an unusually important place to study this because of what sits above it. Interstate 15 passes directly through the corridor, connecting Southern California with the interior west. Rail lines use the same general route. Energy infrastructure crosses the region. Water and communication systems depend on major transportation corridors. So the importance of Cajon Pass isn't only geological, it is also practical. A major earthquake affecting the region could damage roads, disrupt rail service, interfere with utilities, and make emergency response more difficult. The infrastructure that helps Southern California function could itself become part of the earthquake problem. And that is why a study like this matters even though it cannot predict an earthquake. The goal isn't to scare people into thinking something is about to happen. The goal is to understand which earthquake scenarios are physically possible and how the fault system might behave if one occurs. For decades, scientists have known that Southern California contains faults capable of producing very large earthquakes. But treating every fault as an isolated line doesn't tell the entire story. The more complicated question is what happens when faults interact. An earthquake begins, stress changes, a nearby fault becomes more or less loaded. The rupture reaches a junction, and then the system has to decide, in a physical sense, whether the rupture can continue. That is the earthquake gate idea. The junction doesn't make decisions. Physics does. The shape of the faults matters. The stress acting on them matters. The friction between the fault surfaces matters. And the condition of the neighboring fault matters. The new model is valuable because it tries to reconstruct how those conditions have changed through time. It isn't simply saying California has a dangerous fault. Everyone already knows that. It is asking why some historical earthquakes stopped while others may have crossed the same complicated region. And the answer may have something to do with the relative stress between the two systems. The present-day model shows high stress on multiple segments. It also shows a relatively similar stress state between sections of the San Andreas and San Jacinto systems. That combination is what makes the result interesting. Not because it proves a large earthquake is coming, but because it gives scientists a clearer picture of the conditions that may influence rupture propagation. And this could have implications beyond California. Major fault junctions exist in many parts of the world. Where two or more active fault systems come together, scientists face the same problem. If an earthquake begins on one fault, what determines whether it stops? What allows it to continue? And what determines how large the final earthquake becomes? Understanding those questions could improve hazard assessments in other earthquake-prone regions as well. It could help engineers consider more realistic earthquake scenarios. It could help emergency planners prepare for infrastructure damage across larger areas. And it could help scientists understand why some historical earthquakes were much larger than their starting ruptures might have suggested. But for people living in Southern California, there is a simpler takeaway. You don't need to know when the next earthquake will happen to prepare for it. You need to know whether your home or workplace can handle strong shaking. You need to secure heavy furniture and equipment. You need emergency supplies. You need a communication plan in case power and cellular networks fail. And if you live near a major transportation corridor, it is worth understanding what happens if the roads you normally depend on become unusable. Preparation isn't based on predicting the future. It is based on accepting that the future is uncertain. And California's geological history makes one thing very clear. Large earthquakes have happened before. They will happen again. The question is not whether the San Andreas and San Jacinto systems are capable of producing powerful earthquakes. They are. The more interesting question is how those faults interact when one of them finally ruptures. The Fort Cajon earthquake of 1857 appears to have stopped at Cajon Pass. The evidence from the 1812 event suggests that another rupture may have crossed the junction. Two major earthquakes, two different outcomes. And now scientists have a model that allows them to examine the stress conditions surrounding those different outcomes across roughly 1,000 years. That is a major improvement in our understanding of the system. But it still leaves one question unanswered. If the earthquake gate has opened before, and if the present-day stress conditions around the junction are unusually high and relatively balanced, what will the system do the next time a major rupture begins? Scientists don't know, and that's precisely why they are studying it. The new model doesn't give California a countdown. It doesn't tell us that the next major earthquake is coming tomorrow. What it does is give researchers a much clearer picture of the mechanical conditions beneath one of the most important fault junctions in Southern California. The faults have a history. The rocks preserve that history. The earthquakes change the stress, and the stress continues to evolve long after the shaking disappears. Cajon Pass may look like nothing more than a highway through the mountains, but underneath that highway is a geological junction that has helped determine how some of California's largest earthquakes behaved in the past. Now scientists have reconstructed 1,000 years of that story and found that the present-day system deserves close attention. Not because the Earth has announced its next earthquake. It hasn't. But because the better we understand how these faults interact, the better prepared we can be for the moment when they eventually move again. And that is why studies like this matter. They don't eliminate uncertainty. They help us understand it. If you want grounded, fact-first coverage of earthquakes, volcanoes, climate events, and the other forces changing our planet, subscribe to WideView. And tell me in the comments, if scientists could eventually determine what allows an earthquake to cross from one major fault onto another, would that change how you think about earthquake risk in California? Because we may never know exactly when the next earthquake will strike. But the more we understand the system beneath our feet, the less surprising its next move has to be.